Hello and welcome to the HP Enterprise Security Thought Leadership Series. My name is Guy Clapperton. I'm an independent journalist. Here to have a discussion about the cyber threat landscape is Simon Leach, Technical Director at HP Enterprise Security for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Simon, thank you for coming in. Let's start with the basics. Is this rise of cyber attacks that we've all been reading about just scaremongering, or is it reality?
I think the number of cyber threats that we're experiencing is definitely increasing. Whilst security companies are often very quick to romanticize the cybersecurity threat, large enterprises and governments are experiencing the toughest threat landscape than they've seen in the history of information. And especially as these organizations are starting to make more and more of their digital assets available online, or at least accessible via the internet, the threat is becoming more and more real, and attackers are more and more interested in trying to get access to some of this information. We've also seen a lot of interest from the press, and most recently Richard Clarke, who is a retired national coordinator for security, cyber infrastructure and cybersecurity in the US, has said that in his opinion most large US organizations have already been hacked. And this is something that we've seen ourselves. Recently, HP carried out some research together with the Ponemon Institute, where we identified that over the past 12 months, organizations are experiencing 44% more attacks than they did in the previous 12 months. So the situation is definitely becoming more and more serious from an organizational perspective.
Okay, so there's no doubting the scale and indeed the increase, but let's zero in a bit on the nature of the attacks. What are the most common threats for organizations?
I think there are four main attack vectors that we're seeing being used at the moment. Distributed denial of service attacks, advanced persistent threats, the insider threat, and also attacks against vulnerabilities in applications. So if we look at each of those in a little bit more detail, distributed denial of service attacks are basically an attempt by a hacker or a group of attackers to launch an attack against a resource to make that resource unavailable for other users. So take an example of a website. A distributed denial of service attack against that website would basically involve sending so much traffic to the website that its resources become overloaded and legitimate requests are no longer handled correctly. And as an attack vector, this has been used quite a lot recently by those involved in the concept of hacktivism, which is really using hacking to further one's personal political agenda.
So can I just clarify, the site actually crashes or it vanishes from view? What would typically happen in those cases?
It will typically be off air for a short period of time whilst the attack is underway, but typically doesn't cause any lasting damage to the website. So it's still available once the attack stops.
Okay, so you said there were three more major.
Yes, so the second one is the concept of an advanced persistent threat, and this was initially a term used by the government to describe some cyber attack exercises that they were carrying out, the US government, okay. Yes. But it's become more and more identifiable as an attack vector that is being used by attackers today, and it typically means breaking into an organization, trying to remain undetected for a long period of time, and stealing relevant information from the organization. So as opposed to other types of attack vectors, it typically doesn't cause any lasting damage. It's more about stealing the information and getting that information outside of the organization.
I suppose the damage will depend on what the nature of the information is and what they can
exactly.
do without.
No damage to the infrastructure, but of course damage to the company's reputation will definitely be occurring.
Of course.
The third attack vector I mentioned was the concept of the insider threat. And this is really something from that an organization has to deal with on an education level. So the insider threats can be one of two types. They can either be malicious or non-malicious, and probably the more common ones are non-malicious. It's people doing things in the internal network infrastructure or with their corporate-owned assets that unfortunately lead to data loss or lead to a cybersecurity incident within that organization. And then the fourth one is the concept of vulnerabilities in applications. If we look today, more and more organizations are using the internet as a way of offering business services or advertising their existence. And they're doing this through applications, web applications that typically they've designed themselves. And again, referring to the Ponemon research I mentioned earlier, one of the takeaways from that research was that 72% of the organizations we've spoken to test less than 10% of their web applications on a regular basis. And when you think that some of the large hack attacks we've seen over the past 12 months have involved the exploitation of a vulnerability in a web application, it becomes of paramount importance that organizations start to think about web application security and fixing vulnerabilities that they've created themselves in these applications as part of their security design and their security policy.
A lot to think about there. Simon Leach, thank you very much indeed for your time, and thank you all for watching.